everybody for coming to hear Jennifer Tackaberry's Master's Defense. I want to read a little bit about Zoom etiquette for these defenses. All audience participants will be muted throughout the defense. Please do not attempt to turn on your video or share your screen during the talk. There will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions live at the end of the talk. Once Jen has finished her talk, you can use Zoom's raise hand feature to notify me that you'd like to ask a question. The raise hand feature is located under the reactions tab at the top of the Zoom window, and I'll remind you of that at the end of the presentation. I have a little bit of an intro on Jen. She grew up on the East Coast and graduated with a bachelor's degree from Colby College in biology and environmental science. I had a little trouble finding really old, funny photos of her, which is probably, she's probably fine with that. I did get one from a friend of hers from when she was an intern at a whale research institution on the East Coast shortly after college. But after college, she went on to develop her career in marine mammal science. And rather than listing everything on her CV, which would take way too long, I'll summarize by saying she, by the time she came to do her master's, had over 10 years of experience captaining research vessels working on marine mammal research, including extensive experience with large whale disentanglement. And she's one of few people in the United States authorized to actually lead and perform the disentanglement efforts for large whales, which is very important and very dangerous work. One of the projects that, and I have just a selection of various research field photos from her past. One of the projects that she was involved with was the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary Humpback Whale Foraging Project, which has been going for quite a while. And you'll hear more about this in her defense because she used these data as part of her thesis project. And I was also involved with this project back in the day. And so that's one of the ways that we knew about each other and how she found me as a potential advisor. And it's actually funny because as we put together photos for these presentations, neither of us really remembered overlapping on the project, but both of us found photographic evidence of this. This is the kind of welcome board on the ship, and you can see both me and Jen right next to each other there, which neither of us really remember. And if you watch closely in her defense, I think there's another photo of the two of us next to each other. But basically, because of all this very extensive field work and experience with humpback whales, even she managed to take the cover photo for a journal article in PNAS. It was a very easy decision to take her as a grad student, partially because I figured I wouldn't have to do any work as an advisor. And that sort of turned out to be true. She integrated well into the vertebrate ecology lab and did well in her coursework. And about halfway through her degree, the pandemic hit, and I sort of disappeared because of the need to do full-time childcare. And then a couple months after that, I told her I was going on maternity leave, basically for the rest of her thesis. So I was largely absent for the second half of her project, and she still managed to complete her thesis, do all the analysis, do a bunch of field work as part of her second job. And she even took my other student, Jack Barkowski, out on the water and gave him some great training and field experience. And she published a paper on humpback whale nursing behavior using tag data, which isn't even part of her thesis. So I'm very impressed and proud of all the work that she's accomplished during her time here, and I hope you enjoy listening to her thesis defense. Thanks for coming.
All right. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming. Today, I'll be talking about humpback whale feeding dynamics from the perspective of the individual, insights from demography, life history, and biologging. Now, before I begin, I do want to thank you all for joining me, and I do want to acknowledge all of these different organizations that are on this slide. So they helped fund my time at Moss Landing, my research, and my life while working towards this master's degree, as well as many of these organizations also provided data for this analysis. And before I begin, I also want to acknowledge my committee, Allison, Gita, Tom, and Juke. Thank you so much for all the time, mentorship, and guidance, as well as all the PIs that provided their data and encouraged me to pursue these questions, including Ari, Jeremy, Susan, Juke, Mason, and Dave Wiley. And I do just want to note that all of this research was done under multiple NOAA permits and IACUCs, and the images of whales during this presentation were all taken under permits as well. But I do want to begin by talking about the motivation behind my study. So to many people, this is just a slide of whale tails. And if you work in the Gulf of Maine, basically each one of these whales you probably know by name. You might know the year it was born or when it was first seen. You'll also be able to pick out mothers and their offspring or siblings, as well as some preferred associates, as well as individuals that we see in repeated associations year after year or multiple times during the year until we don't. And that's just because humpback whales don't have long-term stable associations. So these preferred associations and longer-term groupings are sort of the exception to the rule rather than the rule itself. So when you're working in the field, you sort of come up with these theories and you start to wonder why humpback whales don't stay in these stable long-term groups. And also when you do see these preferred associations, is that both whales actually choosing to partner up? Or is it one that, maybe is like your younger sibling that's sort of tagging along? So, these were all just sort of thoughts and impressions. And so we need to be able to take a step back to better understand what we're seeing and provide a method to test these theories. So to sort of take a step back, there are a variety of factors that cause foraging needs and abilities to vary with demographics. And that can include behavioral differences or morphological constraints or physiological constraints. And then those different foraging requirements among demographics can manifest in variations of habitat use or feeding behaviors, or even targeted primary prey species. Then in addition to these different foraging requirements of demographics, different species have different societal structures. So a lot of people are familiar with the stable matrilineal society, and those consist of family units with individuals of different demographics, all staying together in a stable group. So in those cases, the burden can fall on group members to ensure that the foraging requirements of all demographics are met. So some may have to sacrifice some of their behavioral states to be able to maintain that long-term stable group. However, since all the animals are genetically related, they can still benefit from that relatedness and making self-sacrifices because it's for the greater good of your relatives. Another type of society can have population segregation, and this can result in individuals with similar foraging needs or abilities that can target the same prey species or habitats. So these individuals can sort of split into different sections in order to maintain stable units with other individuals that have similar foraging needs or abilities. Then the third type of social structure is a fission-fusion social structure, and that's what most of my research is focused on. So within this society, groups of unrelated individuals join and split over relatively short periods of time. So it's a very fluid and dynamic society, which frees individuals from the constraints of having to modify their behavioral states or foraging methods to maintain longer, more stable units. So within a fission-fusion social structure, it's a little easier to be able to determine different energetic needs or foraging ability by individuals in different demographics. And so we can look at how those needs are met by individuals using different feeding methods. And sort of what I mean by this is if you're a younger individual, maybe you're still learning all the different feeding methods and you haven't mastered them. And so you don't quite have all the skills needed or a larger repertoire of feeding behavior. And that might reduce your ability to coordinate your behavior with others. And that sort of is more the second part of my study, which I'll talk about later. But when you become an adult, it's possible that you've mastered all your foraging needs or methods. And so you have the skills you need, and you have an increased ability to coordinate your behavior with others. But then once you have a kid, that might affect things. So, is a female with a dependent calf, now she might need to make sacrifices for that individual, and that may reduce her ability to coordinate her feeding method with others. We can also look at the percentage of time spent foraging, depending on your demographic. So, are you like this hamster that's eating all the time, or this dog that seems less interested in food? And so based on sex or age class, we can see if there's differences in the percentage of time spent feeding, or based on reproductive state. So in the years that you have a calf, are you spending more time foraging to compensate for the need of nursing your offspring compared to years that you're not pregnant and you're just resting? So once we get a handle on how demographics influence the feeding methods used and the percentage of time spent foraging, then we can start to see if these individuals are even able to coordinate or cooperate together. Now, I do want to make sure we're on the same page with the meaning behind coordinated behaviors versus cooperations. And so in this study, coordinated behaviors tend to be behaviors that are synchronized in time and space, versus cooperation, which is sort of an act of individuals working together to obtain a mutual goal, or individuals benefiting from a partnership. So a lot of people can infer cooperation just by seeing coordinated behaviors, but that's not quite the case. So if you didn't know what a race was and you saw these two runners, their behaviors by that definition are coordinated, right? They're synchronized in time and space. But we know, in fact, that these two individuals are not cooperating. They're actually directly competing with each other. So if you look at this image of two whales lunging at the surface of the water, once again, their behaviors are coordinated, synchronized in time and space, but yet we can't infer that they are cooperating, so that they're both benefiting from lunging at the same time, versus those two individuals actually competing with each other and racing towards that prey patch. And they just so happen to basically cross that finish line at the same time. So it can be difficult to determine if coordinated behaviors are a form of cooperation. However, there's a form of coordination called collaborative coordinated behaviors. And if you had just caught an earlier portion of that race, it was a relay race, so you would have seen two teammates hand off the baton. And so even though their behavior is not synchronized in time and space, when one runner stops, the other one's beginning, they're still working together. It's sort of a delineation of tasks. And so that can make it a little easier to be able to determine if that's a form of cooperation. Now, I do want to briefly describe different forms of cooperation and just make sure we're on the same page when it comes to these definitions. So for cooperation, you can have a receiver that is benefiting from another individual's behavior, or an actor. And so that interaction can happen once or multiple times. But in order for behavior to be considered a form of cooperation, I'm using the definition in which the inclusive fitness of both the actor and the receiver must increase. And the inclusive fitness is the direct fitness and the indirect fitness combined for an individual. Now, the direct fitness is an individual's reproductive success or survival, whereas its indirect fitness is the reproductive success or survival of related individuals or individuals that share the same genetic traits. So in one form of cooperation called altruism, in that case, the actor's direct fitness is actually reduced compared to the receiver, but both of their indirect fitnesses are increased, and in total, their inclusive fitness is increased. So one common example of this could be worker bees. In this situation, worker bees, they themselves are not reproducing, and they're working quite hard in order for the queen to reproduce. And so their direct fitness is reduced. However, their indirect fitness is increased because, evolutionarily speaking, they're winning since there's more individuals that are related to them in the population. Another form of cooperation is called mutually beneficial behaviors. And these are the ones that most people are familiar with. So in this case, both the actor and the receiver, both directly and indirectly benefit from a behavior. So if you think of pack hunting, when more animals work together, they can bring down larger prey, and therefore they can all benefit from that relationship. However, there's another form of mutually beneficial behaviors in which one individual benefits from another's action. But when there's role exchange or they reverse those roles, they both benefit from it. And that's called direct reciprocity. So it's the idea of I scratch your back, you scratch mine, or in this situation with an animal grooming another, and then the groomee becomes the groomer later on. So in one interaction, it may not seem that both are benefiting, but if you watch that interaction over time, then you'll see that role reversal, and it'll be a form of direct reciprocity, therefore mutually beneficial to both individuals. Another form of mutually beneficial behavior is weak altruism. And in this case, they're all benefiting, except the actor is benefiting less than the receiver. So if you sort of think of every group project you've ever done, you feel like you're putting in all this effort and no one else in the group is working as hard as you are. And so they're sort of mooching off of your efforts. However, if you refuse to do any work at all and you refuse to be part of a group, then you would have failed. And so you do benefit by being part of the group. However, those other teammates are benefiting more than you are from your work. Then opposite of cooperation is selfishness, which is basically a form of competition or parasitism within the same species. So in this situation, the actor's behavior negatively affects the receiver across the board. And if you think of this, it's basically one individual stealing from another, or the free rider theory, just one basically benefiting from another, but not returning that favor. So once you have an understanding of the collaborative coordinated behaviors and the different forms of cooperation, then if you have a study species with a fission-fusion social structure, you can start to determine if a certain behavior is that. So we're going to use a make-believe species, the ginger wolf, for this example. And so if you have individuals within that population, then you need a behavior with a clear delineations of tasks. So we'll say, it's food sharing. And so you have an actor who goes out hunting, and then it comes back with the food and another individual eats part of that food. So then you can start watching to see if there's actually an exchange of roles, and if that pair exchanges that more energetically demanding role. And so you can see with those partnerships, if they only occur once, then there's no role exchange, or if they occur multiple times. So for some reason, it seems like those two individuals pair up more often. So maybe there's a benefit to it, sort of that weak altruism, even though the actor is always the actor and putting in more effort, for some reason, maybe it is benefiting from sharing its food or having that receiver take some of its food. And then you can see if there's repeated events with role exchange. So that direct reciprocity, therefore, in a clear case of mutual beneficial behavior. Now, with that, you can start to see if there's forms of cooperation, if it's almost all repeated events with it, roles exchanged, or is it a form of competition? So are receivers always receivers and they just seem to be taking advantage of an actor's behavior? Or can you not quite tease out what the pattern is? And so maybe it's by random chance and there's really no benefit or negative effect of those partnerships. However, if you add in demographic information, it might start to explain some of the pattern you're seeing. So it's again in this make-believe species, the ginger wolf, you can see adult females are the ones that will do that role exchange or direct reciprocity. It looks like adult males are always the actor and juveniles are always the receiver. So that added information with that demographics can maybe help explain, maybe with juveniles, they aren't large enough or don't have the skills yet to go hunting themselves. And so they need to take advantage of an adult's behavior in order to get that food. So if we step back into the real world, for this study, we used humpback whales as a study species with a fission-fusion social structure. And then we use the Gulf of Maine humpback whale population as a study population just because of all the demographic information that we have about individuals in the Gulf of Maine. We were able to look at the effects of demography on feeding methods individuals used, as well as the percentage of time individuals spent foraging. The Gulf of Maine humpback whale population also has a behavior with a clear delineation of tasks, and that's called kick feeding. And so we could determine who the actors and receivers were in each of those behavioral interactions. And then when we added demographic information to that, we could help determine if it was a cooperative behavior, a form of competition, or if there was something else explaining those interactions. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with humpback whales, their scientific name is Megaptera novaeangliae, which actually means big-winged New Englander. So they're named for their large flippers. This is sort of the face of the whale, and that arrow is pointing to the tip of its top jaw. And so these are baleen whales, so they do not have teeth. Instead, they have baleen plates, which are made of the same protein that your hair and fingernails are made out of. And these are the arrows pointing to the baleen there. They're also rorqual species, so they have pleats, so they're gulp feeders. So when they come across either a school of bait fish or a patch of krill, they'll take a huge mouthful of water and food and then close their mouth, push the water out through the baleen plates, but the fish will get trapped on the inside. And so these are large, long-lived species, and their minimum age of calving is 5 years old. And we can also identify individuals through their fluke pattern as well as their dorsal fin. So in the Gulf of Maine, we tend to give them names relating to their fluke pattern so we can identify the individuals quite quickly in the field. So this is a whale named Lutris, named after a marking that sort of looks like a sea otter. And this one's named Elephant, based on a marking that sort of looks like an elephant. And to give you an idea of where the study area is, if we were all in person today, we'd be in California at Moss Landing, and the Gulf of Maine is across the continent in the Western North Atlantic. So in the Gulf of Maine, it ranges from the Bay of Fundy up in Canada, all the way down to the area around Cape Cod in Massachusetts. The population data I'm using is from the entire Gulf of Maine population. However, two of the data sets that I'm using for the analysis mostly focus in the southern Gulf of Maine, around Cape Ann and Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Now, the Gulf of Maine is one of many different feeding grounds in the North Atlantic, and it's actually the southernmost feeding ground. And whales from that population go down to the Caribbean to breed. Now they go down to these warmer, low latitude waters that are not very productive. So they're actually fasting during the breeding season. And that's where they'll mate or give birth. Gestation period is about a year. And then they'll spend the summer months up on the feeding grounds, which they'll spend the whole time basically feeding in order to restock their energetic stores so that they're able to make that migration and spend their time in the breeding ground once again. Females that are lactating or nursing their calves have that extra energetic cost because they'll nurse their calf for most of the feeding season. In the Gulf of Maine, there is a primary prey species that these humpback whales target, and that's the sand lance or sand eel. So these are small pencil-like fish or length fish, and they can bury themselves in the sand. And these whales will use 4 main feeding methods to target these sand lance or sand eels. And so that made it a nice study species as well, because instead of going after multiple different prey species, all of these behaviors were basically targeted at the sand lance or sand eels. So with this information, then I could start to look at some of the questions I had. So my first hypothesis I tested was that age, sex, and reproductive state of humpback whales influenced their feeding method in the Gulf of Maine. And my second hypothesis that I was testing was age, sex, and reproductive state of humpback whales influence the percentage of time they spend foraging in the Gulf of Maine. Then I could move on to my second question about kick feeding as a form of cooperation. So I tested the hypothesis that kick feeding is a form of cooperation displayed through role exchange or repeated associations as forms of direct reciprocity or weak altruism. And then I threw in a fourth hypothesis that if role exchange does not occur, it's the individual's role in kick-feeding dyads are influenced by demographics, therefore hindering the individual from exchanging roles. So to test these four hypotheses, I used 3 different data sets. So the first data set was a biologger data set. And this is from the Stellwagen Bank Nash Marine Sanctuary Tagging Project. And I used a subset of the data from 2015 through 2019 because at that time we were using CATS tags, or custom animal tracking solution tags, which not only were applied using suction cups and collected accelerometry data, but they also had video cameras. So I was able to verify some of the track data, as well as if the whales were releasing bubbles or when they were lunging. And so that was very helpful for this analysis. So I used TrackPlot and BORIS, which is a behavioral observation research interactive software, and able to analyze some of these tracks. And so with BORIS, I was able to come up with different ethograms to decide different feeding methods, as well as to determine the duration of the tag deployment in which these whales spent different periods of their behavioral states. So this is just an example of TrackPlot. So it's basically a ribbon showing the whale's movements through the water column. At this point, the whale was blowing bubble nets. So you can do see those spirals it was swimming in. And the red and blue triangles are the fluke strokes. So this is a form of kick feeding. And so this I could go through and mark the different feeding methods, as well as the percentage of the track that the whales were spending foraging versus in other behavioral states. So the 4 main feeding methods I was auditing for in this track data was, the first one is basic lunge feeding. And this is a predominant feeding method in other populations, and most humpback whales populations use lunge feeding. And it's basically the whale just accelerates towards the prey patch, opens its mouth, and takes a huge mouthful of prey and water. And with this feeding method, there aren't any bubbles or aren't any extra behaviors before that lunge. Surprisingly, this was the rarest feeding method that I found during my study in the Gulf of Maine. Now, bubble feeding is a feeding method that is seen not only in the Gulf of Maine to target sand lance, but it's also seen in Antarctica to target krill, as well as Alaska to target herring. So multiple humpback whale populations use bubble feeding. And bubble feeding includes bubble nets, which are these spirals that the whale will swim in a circle, releasing bubbles, and that will sort of corral the fish into a tighter ball. And then the whale can come up in the middle of that net to consume the prey. They can also release bubble clouds, which are basically just big blasts of bubbles that the whale will come up underneath and consume the prey that way as well. And bubble feeding was the second most predominant feeding method during this study period. Then bottom feeding is a behavior that has only really been described in the Gulf of Maine, and that's likely because sand lance or sand eel can bury themselves in the sand. So this camera angle is looking towards the head of the whale. You can see its flipper, and that's the substrate that's sort of on the top of the frame there until the whale rolls. And you can see it can feed by itself. There can be other whales around, but it'll swim right along the substrate to consume that prey. And they have a bunch of different sort of behaviors they can use at the bottom in order to do that. And bottom feeding was the most predominant feeding method that I found during my study, which was surprising because actually in 95% of the deployments, the bottom feeding events were detected during the day, whereas we thought this was more of a behavior that was definitely dominated at night. Now, kick feeding is the fourth behavior I was looking for, and this has also only been described in the Gulf of Maine. There are similar feeding methods out on the West Coast, like flick feeding, but in this case, the whale will slap its head or its flukes, most often its flukes, against the surface of the water. They can do that once, twice, 3 times. It's very unique to each individual, their kick feeding sequence. Then they can go down. Some of them will blow bubbles. Some of them will blow bubbles before they kick, or some won't blow bubbles at all. And then they'll come up through that disturbance. And this was the feeding method that I could also use as to determine if it was a form of cooperation. because there was only one individual that will do that kick feeding motion at the surface of the water. So they put in all this extra energy to make that disturbance. And then sometimes the second whale would surface through that disturbance without appearing to put any extra effort in to corralling those fish. And so we could determine that the actor who is hitting the surface of the water, and then the receiver, who is the other whale coming up through that, based on surface observations. Now, in addition to the tag data, I could also use focal follows. So once we place tags on these whales, then we would follow them and record surface observations using the Whale Center of New England's 80 code ethogram. And so that could help verify some of the behaviors I was seeing on the tags as well. But I also use the focal follow data from the Whale Center of New England to do the kick feeding analysis for cooperation. So I used the subset of data from 2005 through 2009 when I was part of the organization. So I audited a subset of the trips, so the trips I was on, as well as paired with Carsick. And basically all the individuals from those trips became my study population. And then I audited the sequence sheets for kick feeding behavior. And animals that were kicking by themselves became solo kick feeders. And then kick feeders that had an associate became part of a kick feeding dyad. So in this example, once again, as we named the whale division was kicking. So you can see it's flipper flick, lobtail was the kick feeding action, and then came up through a bubble cloud. And it was the actor, so it was doing the kicking. And it was with this other whale, Tunguska, who also came up through the cloud, but didn't do any of the kick feeding behavior. So it was the receiver. And then I could go through and keep track of who was actors and receivers, and then see if during this 5-year study period, was there ever an opportunity, or was there ever a time that Tunguska was the kicker or the actor and division was the receiver. So that role exchange. So once I had these two data sets, I could then apply the Center for Coastal Studies long-term population data set to the focal follow as well as the tag data. Now, the Gulf of Maine population is pretty unique in the fact that we can track these individuals and we know so much data about all of these individuals. So this is a whale named Salt that in this case, from 79, she's been seen every year since. And so we have a documentation of every calf she has had. And then we can follow those individuals throughout their life to determine all the calves they have, and so on and so on. And so we can have up to 5 generations now of matrilineal lines and knowing who's related to who, as well as having a very detailed knowledge about the life history state of females during specific years. So just to give you an idea of how we applied this data. So let's say we first saw Salt in 79. It was not a calf, so we didn't know the age class nor the sex. However, in 1980, she was seen with a calf. So then we knew she was an adult at that point and she was a female. And retroactively, we can then say in 79, she was pregnant. And then we could go throughout her sighting data to see what year she had a calf, retrospectively say that she was pregnant in the year before. And then there are these gap years in which we don't know if she was resting, so not pregnant, or if she was pregnant and just didn't return with a calf the next season. And so we termed that the reproductive state Paris, which means that she was a sexually mature female, but in those years, we did not know if she was pregnant or not. And as another example, she had a calf named Thalassa. So we knew Thalassa's exact age because we saw her as a calf. And so we knew when she was a juvenile. So for this population, the minimum age of calving is 5. So anything before that, after your calf year, so whether you're 1, 2, 3, or 4 years old, you're considered a juvenile. Then Thalassa had her first calf in 92. And we could retroactively go in and say she was pregnant in 91. But then there's this gap year between when she was a juvenile and when she had her first calf. So we turned females when they were in this state as a null Paris. So that meant they were no longer a juvenile, but we had yet to document them as pregnant or lactating. And then we could go on with the rest of her life and determine when she was Paris, pregnant, or lactating. So we could apply all of this life history data and demographic information to both the biologger data set as well as the focal follow data set for kick feeding to start to test my hypotheses. So for the first hypotheses, I did have a few predictions. I predicted that juveniles would use fewer, less elaborate feeding methods. So I figured they'd basically use that basic lunge feeding. So just lunging through the water, no fancy bubbles or behavior prior to that. I thought based on sex alone that males and females would use the same feeding methods. So once you're an adult, I figured you had the same repertoire and there'd be no reason for you to use one feeding method over another. But I thought, well, while females were in different reproductive states, then they might use different feeding methods depending, if they had a dependent calf with them or something like that. And for the second hypothesis, I predicted that juveniles would spend less time feeding than adults, whereas females may spend slightly more time feeding than adults. They are, as a species as a whole, females are supposed to be larger than males. However, individual variation really does muddle that difference. But I thought maybe based on reproductive state that lactating and pregnant females may dedicate more of their time feeding to compensate for either the pregnancy or nursing a calf compared to females that were juvenile or nulliparous. So to dive into results for this first analysis, there were 29 cat tags between 2015 and 2019 that met my criteria for this study. So they were at least 30 minutes long. They had good accelerometry data, and they also had video. And you can see by this map, we left out of either Provincetown Harbor or Stage Harbor on Cape Cod. And then when we found a large aggregation of whales, we started to deploy the tags. And so you can see this is where we at least initially put the tags on, not necessarily where the whales stayed. During the 5 years, we did not evenly distribute the tags among demographics. So most of the tagged whales were females, most of them were adults, and 50% of the females were paras. But I did find that sex influenced the feeding methods used. So females use bubble feeding and bottom feeding more often than they use kick feeding or basic lunge feeding during my study. And I also found that females actually used bottom feeding more often than males did. I found that age class also influenced the feeding method used. So once again, adults use bottom feeding and bubble feeding more often than kick feeding or basic lunge feeding. However, I did not detect any juvenile tag deployments. None of them had kick feeding or basic lunge feeding on them. However, my sample size of juveniles was quite small. It was only 3 individuals. So statistically, I could not say that juveniles had a preference or an avoidance of certain feeding behaviors. When looking at the percentage of time spent foraging, I did not see or have any results that suggested that demographics influenced the percentage of time individuals spent feeding. However, if you look at this box plot among the females, you'll see that there does appear to maybe be a trend with lactating females spending a higher proportion of their time foraging than juvenile females or nulliparous females. Once again, not statistically significant, but this does hint at maybe a larger sample size will help determine if this trend is in fact true, or if this is just unique to the whales that I tagged or that we tagged during my study period. So to quickly discuss those results with the females and adults that use bottom feeding and bubble feeding more often. This is important. One, just because we did think bottom feeding, well, it is the most dominant feeding behavior at night. So we only had a few instances of bubble feeding at night, or we had one case where a male used a feeding method that had yet to be described, but I couldn't verify what prey species was going after because it was at night. But they're using bottom feeding much more during the day than I thought they did. And this is important because it also goes along with the fact that more females are using bottom feeding. And so that means that mother and calf pairs and also just females in general are using the entire water column. And so that means not only are they swimming down to the bottom, but they're also spending a lot of time at the bottom, both during the day and night, which can increase the risk of anthropogenic threats in those areas, especially for fishing gear. When it came to age class, So juveniles, I detected fewer feeding methods used by juveniles than adults. And I also didn't find that juveniles used basic lunge feeding, which was one of my predictions. I thought that they would use basic lunge feeding more than adults did, and not the case. However, there were shorter deployments on juveniles, and I did have one confounding factor in my study was that longer deployments detected more feeding methods. So unfortunately, all the juvenile deployments fell under the average duration of, it was around 13 hours worth of data was sort of the average duration of the tag. So all the juvenile deployments fell underneath that. And so that could have affected the opportunity or the chance for me to detect basic lunge feeding or kick feeding on these shorter deployments that just happened to be on juveniles. Now, also juveniles represent a smaller portion of the population in general. So sort of detecting a rare behavior on a smaller sample size. So once again, I couldn't say for sure that juveniles had an aversion or a preference for certain feeding methods. And a higher effort is needed to either tag juveniles or just using another type of data set to try and answer these questions. I wasn't able to take into some additional influences that may have affected these results. So environmental conditions or the amount of prey available each year, or how that changed depending on the day that we tagged these individuals. I wasn't able to take that into consideration. I also didn't have data on the individual's overall health or the body size. So if an individual was in poor health and couldn't feed, was spending more time resting, or a larger whale versus a smaller whale. I also did not have information on the behavior of the whale prior to tagging. So, was the whale feeding for 2 days straight and then we tagged it, and so it wasn't feeding it as often, or possibly the reverse. And then even though I found the demographics did not influence the percentage of time spent feeding, there was that trend. And so it just goes to show we need to increase the sample size. And I did restrict this study's time to tags that had video data as well. But thankfully, the Selwag Bank Natural Marine Sanctuary tagging project has been going on for almost 2 decades now. And so we can start to look at this using other tag data that might not have video to specifically look to see if females in different reproductive states spend different portions of their time feeding. I did think that longer deployments and technological advances would help, especially with capturing feeding behavior at night, being able to determine what they're feeding on, or if they're releasing bubbles, things like that would be helpful. But this is just an example of 2 males that were tagged on the same day, and their tags basically lasted for at least 2 consecutive nights. And this one whale spent the whole night feeding, whereas the second whale did not feed at all. And then the following night, the first whale once again spent basically the whole night feeding, and the second whale only spent 50%. So having longer deployments, I think we get a better understanding of how these whales spend their time on average foraging, rather than just a glimpse of a couple of hours at a time, which can be very dependent on the formation of the prey at that moment, or what the whale's behavior was prior to or after. And so once again, longer deployments with some technological advances would help answer some of the questions that came up during this study. And then I do want to acknowledge that this project occurred right at the peak of the feeding season. So the timing of this project was late June to early July. And this was perfect because it basically increased our opportunity to get the largest amount of each demographic. So basically everyone had come back to the feeding ground. And so we had the best opportunity to tag whales in all different life history states or sexes and age classes. And that's important because in March, that's when that's when pregnant females can return as early as March to the feeding grounds, whereas lactating females may show up a little later around June. And so it would be helpful to also start tagging both early and late in the season so that we can capture these differences between these different reproductive states or age classes, and basically capture these demographics when they first return to the feeding ground and possibly right before they leave the feeding ground to go down to the breeding ground, to have a better understanding of how their feeding behavior changes throughout the foraging season. So now that we have a good understanding on the influence of demographics on feeding methods and percentage of time feeding, then we can start to look at, well, can these whales even coordinate or possibly cooperate during different feeding methods? So take a breather before we jump in. But there was none of the findings in my first study suggested that it would be impossible for these whales to coordinate or cooperate based on their demographic. So to test my third hypothesis, I did have the prediction that I figured cake feeding was a form of cooperation and that we would see that through role exchange over time. And with a fourth hypothesis that if role exchange did not occur, that the demographics influence the individual's roles in cake feeding. So my prediction was that juveniles were more likely to be receivers than actors. And I figured that because they probably just didn't have the skills yet to be an actor. I didn't think really the sex would influence whether an individual was an actor or receiver. But I did think once again that the reproductive state may influence that. So maybe depending on if a female had a dependent calf or not, she would prefer or not to be part of a cake feeding dyad. So during the 5-year study period, there were 62 cake feeding dyads. And so that's basically partnerships or cake feeding events between two whales. And so I looked for direct reciprocity. But there were only 2 instances during that 5-year study of direct reciprocity. So, and both of these occurred, within the same year. So there was no exchange of roles across seasons, and that only represented about 4% of the unique pairings. So I thought, well, maybe it's long-term partnerships. So even though they're not exchanging roles, maybe it's more beneficial for an individual to seek out another whale rather than just to randomly pair up. But that didn't appear to be the case either. So there were only 4 repeated dyads. They all only repeated once, and they all repeated within the same season. So once again, there was no long-term partnerships across seasons during the study period. So then I thought, well, maybe they're related, even though on the feeding grounds, so calves will return to the same feeding ground that their mom brought them to. So there is maternally driven site fidelity. However, previous studies have shown that individuals are no more likely to associate with relatives than they are not. But I thought, well, maybe in this case they are, and that was not the case. So there were 14 dyads in which I had information about both individuals, so I could determine if they were related or not. So if they were mother and offspring, or if they were siblings, and none of those 14 dyads were. So that was not a good explanation. So then I thought, well, maybe it's the inexperience of receivers. So possibly the receivers just didn't have the knowledge to be an actor, but that wasn't the case either. So almost 30% of the unique receivers also filled the actor role in a cake feeding dyad. So they had that knowledge and skill set, and they were actors at one point. They just were never actors with the whales that they were receivers for. Also, when comparing this to the solo lobtail feeders, so the individuals during the study that we documented cake feeding, just not in a partnership, 40% of these receivers were also documented as solo lobtail or solo cake feeders. And so they obviously, at least 40% of these whales had the skills and knew how to be a kicker, but just decided not to be one in this study, or not to be an actor for the whale that they had been the receiver for. So there was no evidence that suggested that cake feeding was a form of cooperation. So with that, I moved on to the fourth hypothesis to see how demographics might affect the roles individuals played. And I did find some results. So I found that sex influenced the role in cake feeding dyad, with females more likely to be an actor and males more likely to be a receiver. I found that age class did not influence the role, but that could be, once again, to the small sample size. So adults were seen as both actors and receivers. Juveniles were not documented as actors. There was only one in the 62 dyads, and it was a receiver. And only 1% of solo lobtail feeders were also juveniles. So once again, just a small sample size. And so I can statistically say that juveniles had a aversion or preference to be an actor or a receiver. I did find that reproductive state influenced the role in cake-feeding dyad. So lactating and pregnant females were both seen as actors, both within dyads and also solo lobtail feeding. However, lactating females were underrepresented as receivers and pregnant females were overrepresented. And so it seemed like there was a preference or avoidance of that role based on the female's reproductive state. And I want to look a little further to see, well, for the composition of these. So whether you're a female with a male receiver or same-sex dyads, how did that all play out? So I found that dyads with a female actor and a male receiver was the most frequent combination, followed by same-sex dyads with females. More rare was a male actor with a female receiver. And then the least common was male-male dyads. Now, this is interesting in itself. However, in the Southern Gulf of Maine, there is a slight sex bias towards females. So in the Southern Gulf of Maine, it's basically 60% females to 40% males. And so we would have expected if dyads were formed by random chance alone, so one whale randomly coming across another whale and joining, that the female-female dyads would be the most prevalent. Since I couldn't determine if age class was a factor, there were 29 cake-feeding dyads in which I could determine if the actor was older or younger than the receiver. And so I found that when there was a female actor and a male receiver, more often the female was older than the male. However, in every other case, the actor tended to be younger than the receiver. So this was especially interesting because in same-sex dyads, the actor was younger than the receiver, which sort of went against my predictions. And then regardless of the role the female was in, if she was associated with a male, she was usually older. So that was an interesting finding as well. So to discuss, why I may have found these results. So as a quick review, actors were more often female, receivers were more often male, and with mixed sex dyads, female actors were most common dyad with a male receiver. And then with the reproductive state, fewer lactating females as receivers and more pregnant females as receivers. And so the explanation for these findings were that there is an avoidance of association by specific demographics. So based on previous research, both in the breeding and feeding ground, not specific to cake feeding or not specific to necessarily feeding in general, that if you're a male and you had to join with another whale, you would prefer to join with a female than another male. And so that can start to explain that skew towards mixed sex dyads with female actors and male receivers. We also found that, or past studies have also found, once again, in the breeding and feeding grounds, that females with a calf prefer to be by themselves. However, if they are going to join with a whale, they'll join with a male rather than another female. Contrary to that, pregnant females seem to be more social and so will associate with anyone. And so when you start to add in those social preferences based on demographics, it can start to explain why the cake feeding dyads are skewed towards mixed sex dyads with a female actor. Since there are just more females in the Southern Gulf of Maine, if a whale is caking, it's more likely to be a female. And then depending on your demographic, you'll have a preference of associating or not associating with her. Then to look at age, once again, there was only one juvenile and it was a receiver. And so one explanation for that is just there are fewer juveniles in the overall population. And it might not be that there's a preference for a role. But in the study population, only about 8% of it were juveniles. And even in the solo kick feeder population, only about 2% of them were juveniles. So our findings were not crazy different from the study population. However, more dedicated research towards juveniles would be important. With the same-sex dyads, with the adult actor is usually younger than the receiver. I didn't have a great explanation for that. And so further research is needed. Now, kick feeding is sort of a newer behavior in the population, and it is culturally learned and obliquely spread. So individuals that are not related to each other will learn from each other. So some might say, well, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. And so it's just the younger whales that know kick feeding and the older whales that don't. However, with this analysis, just because the actor is younger doesn't mean it's a young whale. You know, it could be 1 year younger than the receiver, or it could be 20 years younger. So this could have been, you know, a 50-year-old receiver with a 49-year-old actor. And so that's just not a great explanation for this finding. And more research is needed to determine if this is also maybe true for other associations beyond kick feeding. And so I also found that 75% of the time, the female is older than the male in mixed sex dyads. And the reason for that is there's actually fewer males in the southern Gulf of Maine. So in the Gulf of Maine, it seems like older males are found closer to the northern Gulf of Maine, and there's fewer older males in the southern Gulf of Maine. So just as a female gets older, there are fewer whales that are her age or younger, or sorry, her age or older. And so if she's going to randomly associate with a male, if she's older, it's just more likely that another male is younger than her. So with this explanation, it seems like social preferences by demographics likely influences these kick feeding dyads more so than it's a form of cooperation. So we're getting towards the end, but just to wrap this all up, in conclusion, the Gulf of Maine humpback whale population provided a unique opportunity to explore influence of demographics on feeding methods, the percentage of time feeding, and coordinating, and to determine if kick feeding is a form of cooperation. So I did find that sex and age class influence the feeding methods individuals used in the Gulf of Maine, and that bottom feeding is an important feeding method across the board, but especially with females. And so that does highlight the anthropogenic threats. And so future studies or mitigation really needs to consider not only the entire water column, but along the substrate as well, especially when it comes to the threat of entanglement in fishing gear. I didn't find evidence that showed that kick feeding was a form of cooperation, but it looks like the social preference and the local population structure outweighed any benefits that individuals would have gained through repeatedly associating with a specific whale. And then, of course, that increased technological advances of biologgers would help answer even more of these questions that came up as I was analyzing this data. So with that, I do want to acknowledge the fact that I am standing on the shoulders of giants, and there were so many folks that laid the groundwork for understanding these populations and these whales and these behaviors. And so I do want to acknowledge all of the work that I based my work off of. And I do want to acknowledge the Volgenau Foundation, the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and the Center for Coastal Studies, which have generously funded this study, as well as I would have loved to acknowledge everyone by name, but there are just so many people, and these data sets are just so huge, and the long-term data that's been collected has involved so many people. So with the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary Tagging Project, there are so many different universities and nonprofits and government agencies and research organizations with everyone from there coming out year after year. Then, of course, there's the Whale Center of New England staff, naturalist interns, as well as the whale watching companies that allowed us the opportunity to go out and collect all these focal follows and surface behavior of these whales, as well as the staff from the Center for Coastal Studies that not only collects this data, but also maintains the Gulf of Maine humpback whale long-term population data set. So once again, I can't thank everyone enough. You all know who you are, but I really appreciate all your time, effort, and dedication to these projects and helping me get to this point. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. And it looks like Lauren. I think Laura will unmute you, or yeah, go ahead, Lauren.
Hi, Jen. That was amazing. I was just wondering, you kind of talked about a lot about how there were certain things that you had your explanations for and things that you didn't. And I was just wondering what your most surprising finding was, or like the most like exciting and thrilling, like novel scientific discovery.
I think just the fact that demographics did affect the feeding methods that they were using. I didn't really think there would be a difference between sexes. And so that really does open up the window as to future work that we really should concentrate on, and looking at the larger data set to determine possibly the different energetic costs of these different feeding methods. So why is it that females like bottom feeding or prefer bottom feeding, and why is it that males didn't use it as much? And so I think that would be, if I had all the funding in the world, maybe one of the next questions I would try and answer.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Okay, Dave.
There we go. Hi, Jen. Awesome, of course. No surprise there. My question is, because you're not only a great scientist doing this analysis, but you've individually rescued a lot of these animals. Is there a gender asymmetry in the entanglement numbers? Are females more likely to be entangled than males based on their bottom feeding tendencies?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. It seems like juveniles have a higher chance of becoming entangled more than adults do. However, it's been harder, and I think the Center for Coastal Studies might be working on this as well, but to determine where along the fishing gear these entanglements occur. So it's hard to determine if it's up near the surface system that the whale originally got entangled versus down at the substrate. And so luckily they collect data on that, and so we can start to answer those questions, but I don't know if specifically we have the answer as to a high percentage of the females first came into contact at the substrate versus at the surface. Once again, I'd love to answer that question.
Gotcha, thanks. Great work, of course.
Thank you. Oh. I think you're muted, Allison.
I'm muted. I was just saying, are there any other questions? And it looks like there are not. If anyone's having trouble finding the raise hand, you can put your question in the chat. But if there aren't any other questions, Dave is raising his hand again.
So, Jen, do you think that humpback whales are just kind of making up these associations almost ad hoc? I mean, you're not finding really strong tendencies towards particular combinations, but yet we see them working in together. So can they just grab the nearest whale and perform some of these complicated coordinated movements just immediately without practicing with each other? Or what's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I was sort of surprised. Like I definitely thought that my results would show that there are, repeated associations and that it would be easier for individuals who have worked together to work together again. But I do wonder if, they are such a flexible species, each individual sort of has their own take on different feeding methods, that maybe they are able to pick up quite quickly on another whale's feeding method, or if they just see a disturbance and basically are taking advantage of that and just say, sweet, I know what a bubble is, and I know there must be food there, and so trying to swoop in at the same time. So I definitely think there's probably a mix. One thing that I thought would be interesting was to look at some whales like Division. She tended to have quite a few receivers, or if you view it as a form of the receivers taking advantage of the actor, she had multiple whales taking advantage of her. So it's possible that maybe she had a kick feeding sequence that was easier for others to figure out. But that would be one thing to look at. Another possible way to address this would be to, using drones or figuring out which whale is coming up first through that disturbance, to see if, the receiver is waiting for the actor to come up first, or if the receiver is shooting through that disturbance first. That might suggest it's sort of stealing the actor's food versus getting the actor's scraps. And so I think that would be one way, since we can't talk to them to see what their intent is, that would be one way to try and determine based on their behavior what they might be doing. So.
Yeah, cool. Good idea.
Thanks.
Okay, Dave, Cade.
Oh yeah, that was great, Ben. That was really cool. Quick question for you. I was looking at, I love a lot of your results. One of the cool results was the time when you were looking at how the males spent just about as much time as the females foraging. So you had a similar relationship there, males foraging just as much as females, but the females were spending a lot more time doing things like bottom feeding, whereas the males it seemed like they were doing more bubble net feeding. So I guess the question is, does that imply that there are times when the males were feeding differently than the females at the same time, like the males were bubble net feeding while the females were bottom feeding, or was it some other explanatory thing that would explain that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there unfortunately weren't enough to statistically for me to analyze the data to say, well, these two whales were tagged on the same day and their tags overlapped enough to see, well, was one bottom feeding while the other was surface feeding? So I did a quick look at that, and I didn't have a large enough sample size to even pursue that question, but there were cases where one whale, was bottom feeding forever and then started bubble feeding with other whales that were bubble feeding, and then she went back down to bottom feeding. So I think sort of expanding that question to using, D tags and AccuSounds and other tags that might not need the video, but that database, we have enough information to maybe answer that question, because we do tend to do the CATS tags and the D tags or AccuSounds at the same time, and so we might have more overlap. But I think that would be interesting to see if the behavior of the salmlance at that time is different, so that there are some at the surface while there are also some at the substrate. There weren't very many mid-water lunges or anything like that. And so I think understanding the prey's behavior is as important as understanding the humpback's behavior.
Nice.
Thanks for the question.
Any other questions? Okay, then I'll say great job. And I think now, Laura, we unmute and video, is that right?
Yes, everyone can unmute and turn on their video and say congratulations to Jen.
Jen, if you turn off your screen sharing, we could see more people.
Oh, sorry. No, only look at me.
Yay, Jen.
Yay, congratulations.
Great job, Jen.
You did it.
Yeah.
But you still have to come back to the Gulf of Maine.
Oh yeah,
You
definitely.
can't hide in California forever.
Yeah.
I need Jen to stay out here for a little while longer so I can keep working with her, but then you guys can have her back.
Excellent. I can be split both. There's a lot of work to be done on both coasts. So, yeah. Well, thank you everyone for listening in, and you know where to find me if you have any other questions or comments or how the study could or should be improved. But I look forward to continuing this work and figuring out some more of the feeding dynamics of humpback whales on both the east and west coast. So.
Yeah, thanks
And
everyone
that
for
is
coming.
That
Good
is
to
a
see some of you.
behind her also.
Yeah, that was a gift from Doug. Remember where everything was back there. So. All right.
Okay. I think that now the committee stays. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks, Mason.